Hello everyone, and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall Stout. Harvest is an especially busy time for Oklahoma producers, but it's also a great time to think about your safety when it comes to hauling and storing grain and also working around grain bins. We begin with some tips from our stored products engineer, Carol Jones. Carol, in terms of grain bin safety, what kind of things do producers need to be thinking about this time of year at harvest time?
Well, as we go about moving more grain around the state this time of the year, we need to remember that there are some pretty tragic things that can happen if we don't pay attention to the safety and take some precautions when we handle grain and put it into storage.
And what are some of the reasons that people get into the grain bins in the first place?
Well, usually it's because something has gone out of condition within the bin. Some mold has developed, or there's a stoppage in the unloading or loading of the grain in the bin, and we enter the bins to fix that, and that's when the accidents happen.
So if someone does have to get in to adjust something or do some work, there are some safety guidelines to follow. Can you kind of talk about what the criteria is?
First of all, don't ever work alone. Always have someone on the outside of the bin that you're in communication with, that knows you're there and can call for help or help you if you get into some kind of a problem in the bin. Secondly, if you're going to be in grain over your waist or have the entrapment opportunity over your waist, you need to have a harness on. That way it prevents falls and getting pulled down into equipment. You should never enter a grain bin with any kind of equipment engaged. Always lock out and tag out all of the powered equipment like augers and reclaim systems. So those are the main things. We also need to keep our children out of the bins. As kids growing up in the grain industry, we played in the combines and we played in the grain buggies and in the grain bins. But things happen so much faster as we move grain faster these days, and there's more hazards, and it's just not a good place for the children to be.
And they must be especially vulnerable given their size and experience.
Exactly. They don't understand what the hazards are. It just looks like a fun place to play.
And you've studied this a lot. You're a stored products engineer. Talk a little bit about the research that's gone on at OSU on this subject.
We're one of the leading research institutes in the United States for this kind of research on entrapment in grain bins. We have a project right now where we have a full-size mannequin. We call him Jimmy Hoffa, but he's our full-size mannequin. We bury him in different kinds of grain under different conditions. We have force mats we put on the front and back of Jimmy and measure the forces on different parts of his body as he undergoes different actions within the grain. And our ultimate goal is to determine different protocols and develop different equipment to keep people safe, and also to help firefighters rescue someone if they do get entrapped.
And there are techniques to do that, and there is training available?
Yes, we have lots of training available here in Oklahoma. From Oklahoma State, we can come out to 4-H groups or Farm Bureau groups or local fire departments, volunteer fire departments, and go through the basics of accident prevention and entrapment rescue. There's some techniques that we've developed and have been developed all over the country that we've adopted, where we can train people to stay and work safe and stay safe within the grain industry, and also how to remedy a problem when it does happen.
And bottom line is that awareness.
The awareness is essential. If we don't go in the bin, then we don't get hurt.
Okay, Carol Jones, thank you so much, our stored products engineer here at Oklahoma State University.
Thank you.
And those links include many resources on grain bin safety, including this video.
Grain engulfment can happen in all sizes and kinds of storage facilities, from a small on-farm storage unit to large terminal elevators. Each size, type, and location presents its own sets of problems and circumstances. Grain engulfment incidences are not specific to grain storage facilities. They can also happen in transportation vehicles such as hopper-bottom grain trailers and railroad cars. There are three basic ways grain engulfment usually happens: flowing grain, grain bridge collapse, or vertical grain wall collapse. The first type of grain engulfment involves flowing grain. 77% of engulfment occurs while a bin is being unloaded. As long as the unloading system is not running or all unloading openings are closed, there is no grain movement. However, once the unloading system is engaged and the unloading gate is open, grain will start to move. A 10-inch auger can unload up to 65 bushels of grain per minute. The grain forms a funnel-shaped cone on the top, pulling down anything on the surface. A worker has about 2 to 3 seconds to react. Within 4 to 5 seconds, your knees are covered. You'll be unable to free yourself without assistance due to the amount of pressure and friction the grain exerts around your legs. It won't be possible to simply step out of it. Once the grain is above a person's knees, it is physically impossible to free the legs without a lifeline or grabbing onto a support structure. While wearing a lifeline may not help you escape, it will keep you from being pulled further into the grain. Within 22 seconds, you will be covered and your chance of survival is very slim. No one should be allowed in a grain bin with moving grain. To prevent this, all receiving and unloading equipment needs to be tagged and locked out. Your facility must have procedures developed for bin entry. Employees need to follow those procedures in order to help ensure there will not be a grain engulfment. Another way people are trapped in grain is from grain bridging. When grain becomes wet and moldy, it can stick together. If the grain becomes a solid mass on the top surface, unloading it may create a cavity below. Bridging can occur anywhere in the bin. The surface will look solid and undisturbed, but it may hide a cavity that is dangerous to walk on. All employees who are allowed to enter a grain bin must wear a harness and lifeline. If the grain has been unloaded, there should be a dip or inverted cone on the surface. The best way to break up a known grain bridge is to address it from outside the bin. Grain quality management is critical in preventing a grain bridge. The third cause of engulfment is from grain wall collapse. Like grain bridges, grain walls are the result of wet grain that cakes into one large mass on the bin wall or another location within the bin. Freestanding columns of grain can also form. Entering a bin with a grain wall is extremely dangerous due to the potential of the wall collapsing. Employees should never work with grain above their heads. Emergency responders need to be aware that additional grain may be bridged or clinging to the wall. This could collapse on them during the rescue operation. An engulfment victim's greatest threat to their life is suffocation caused by the pressure of the grain against their chest and torso. As the victim exhales, the pressure of the grain continues to increase on their chest until they can no longer expand their lungs to inhale. This is known as compression asphyxia. Totally engulfed victims usually die from inhaling the grain, which blocks their airway and suffocates them. These type of victims rarely survive. Grain quality management is a key to safety because employees will not have to enter a bin. Good quality grain is considered dry enough to store. Wet grain will cause grain temperatures to rise, early insect infestation, mold, mildew, and grain clumping. These conditions cause the grain to stick together, leading to the formation of grain bridges and grain walls. Grain quality will not improve once it's in the bin. It will only continue to deteriorate unless it's monitored and steps are taken to reduce or eliminate the problem. An example of quality management is temperature monitoring. Grain harvested during the hot summer is put in the bin at temperatures close to the outside air temperature. Soon after harvest, aeration fans need to be run. This will equalize the grain temperature and moisture for storage through the summer months. If the outside temperature is cooler than the inside temperature, condensation will form. The condensation will drip from the roof panels onto the stored grain, leading to moisture problems inside the bin. The grain then needs to be cooled as the outside temperatures decrease to avoid the hot air mass in the bin from rising to the cooler roof. Properly sized and spaced aeration fans can move cooler outside air through the grain during the nighttime hours and exhaust the hot air to the outside. Another problem with warm grain is that the potential for insect activity increases anytime the temperature of the grain exceeds 70 degrees Fahrenheit. A rise in temperature can also be an indicator of insect activity or deteriorating grain. Grain put in storage that has a lot of trash in it due to poor farming and harvesting practices can also cause storage problems. Not only is the trashy grain more conducive to insect infestation, but dockage has a tendency to collect at the discharge openings during removal where it can stop the flow of grain. Without a doubt, the more grain facilities can do to maintain good grain quality will eliminate the risk for employees needing to enter a bin. This would eliminate the risk of employee grain engulfment. Regardless how well the grain quality is managed, there are going to be times that employees will need to enter grain bins. Therefore, procedures must be developed to ensure safe entry. When entering a grain bin, an employee must wear a safety harness attached to a lifeline if there is a possibility the employee can sink more than waist deep in grain. As this demonstration shows, flowing grain quickly pulls the victim down to the point that escape is virtually impossible. Once the grain is above a person's knees, it is physically impossible to free the legs without a lifeline or grabbing onto a support structure. And when the victim is buried in grain up to his or her waist, there is no chance of self-rescue. Adequate lighting must be made available to employees before they enter the grain structure. Any lights used inside a grain bin need to be designated for use in areas where combustible dust may be present. These lights must be explosion-proof. All employees entering a grain bin should have an observer present on the outside to monitor. And something goes wrong, it could be a long time before anybody knows there was a problem. There have been situations where no one realized an employee was trapped in a bin until a family member called to ask why their loved one never came home from work. The observer must have communication established with the person inside the grain bin, no matter how long the entrant plans on being inside that bin.
It's going to take another 5 or 10 minutes.
This can be line of sight and verbal communications, or it can be two-way radio communications. If electronic communication devices are to be used, they must be approved for use in explosive dust situations. The observer must also have a source of communication so he or she can quickly contact emergency responders for assistance in the event of an emergency. Grain handling facilities and the grain stored at them can present many challenges to maintain grain quality and safety. Understanding the risks involved with flowing grain and the danger associated with grain quality that has been allowed to deteriorate is essential for the safety of all employees and the profitability of the facility. Your health, safety, and your life is far more important than any grain in a bin. Please follow your safety rules, communicate with employees, and work together to make sure everybody goes home safe.
Joining me once again, Kim Anderson, Grain Marketing Specialist here at Oklahoma State University. Kim, let's start today by talking about U.S. stocks and the situation there.
Well, U.S. wheat stocks are relatively tight. You can go back to 2012-13 marketing year, 718 million bushels. Just finished up the 13-14 marketing year, 583 million bushels. Next year it's projected to be 574 million bushels. Look at hard red winter wheat, go back to 12-13, 343 million, down to 200 million this year. Next year probably 175 to 180 million bushels in these stocks. You know, both of those are well below the averages of, like for the U.S., which was 776 million bushels.
Now, those tight stocks would suggest that we're seeing higher prices.
You'd expect prices to be higher in, say, 13-14 than they were in 12-13 because we had less wheat. But if you look at the average annual prices for the 2012-13 marketing year, $7.77. It fell to about $6.87 for this year. And this next year, the price range is $6.35 to $7.65, which means that prices with lower stocks are expected to be about the same as they were last year. You look at Oklahoma prices, $7.45 a bushel, down to $6.98, probably around that average, maybe slightly lower for this year. You had lower stocks, and lower prices.
Okay, now that would suggest that supply and demand isn't working. Is that just the case of we've got a market issue, or is there some manipulation going on?
Yeah, that's what you'd think, was that something fishy is going on around here. But if you'll look at the world situation with world stocks, why U.S. ending stocks have been going down, world ending stocks have been going up. You can go back to the 12-13 years, 6.44 billion bushels, up to 6.84 billion bushels this year, higher next year at 6.93. So what you've got is higher world stocks and supply and lower U.S. world stocks and supply.
So what does this situation then tell us about U.S. wheat's position in the world?
Well, we have a less of a position in the world than we had, or less market power, if you want to put it that way. You look at U.S. wheat production, this year is projected to be 7.5% of world production. 20 years ago, in 94-95 marking year, it was 12% of world production. You look at our exports, 17% of world exports this year is projected. You go back 20 years in the 94-95 marketing year, 32%. So we're a lot smaller player, less than half of the percentage of exports as we had 20 years ago. So we don't have as much market power. We don't have as much impact on prices as we had 20 years ago.
All right, so then what can we expect from prices in the coming year?
Well, I think this last year that we just finished is a good indication. You go to mid-June of 2013, we had $7.15 prices. In early July, it was down to $6.85. By mid-October, it's up to $7.47. By mid-November, it's back down to $6.81. In late January, it's $5.95, below $6. But by late March, it's back up to $7.67. Early May, we had $8.05. Where are we now? Somewhere in the $6.80 range. A lot of price variability, and the reason for changes in those prices is mostly what was going on around the world. Now in January we had a good big pristine hard red winter wheat crop that deteriorated, and I think that run up to 8.05 was the market looking at a short hard red winter wheat crop coming on. We got that short crop, but during the same time world production expectations were increasing, and so world trumped U.S.
All right, so all that in mind, how does the producer plan for this coming year?
Well, I think they've got to remember that the average price is about $6.50. They got to realize there's a lot of volatility and that the price is not going to be determined in the United States. It's going to be determined around the world and what world production is. With all that uncertainty, with all the unknown information, with only 7.7% of the world production, then I think you just stagger it into the market, either a third at harvest, a third September, October, and the final third November, December time period, or some strategy that moves out over time and you dollar cost average in and take an average price.
All right, Kim Anderson, Grain Marketing Specialist here at Oklahoma State University.
The calves that were born last fall have or soon will be weaned. Some of those calves will be the heifers that we're going to keep as replacement heifers to go into our fall calving herd, and those heifers will be bred next November. It's very important, of course, that they continue to grow from weaning until breeding time next November, and they have to grow at a rate of about 1 1/3 to 1 1/2 pounds per head per day. Just putting them out on native pasture or Bermuda grass pasture in the June or early July might provide that kind of growth. But as those plants start to mature and lose protein content, then those heifers won't receive the nutrition that they need to continue to grow at the rate that we want them to grow. That's where we can use a supplement program called Oklahoma Gold, and that's just the use of a high protein, something around 40% crude protein, fed at the rate of 1 1/2 to 2 pounds per head per day. That protein goes a long ways towards helping those heifers better utilize the grass in July, August, and September so that they'll continue to grow at that 1 1/2 pounds per head per day. As we're putting together that Oklahoma Gold feed, I would really suggest that you include one of the ionophores, either Rumensin or Bovatec, for those replacement heifers. Research shows that those ionophores do a great job of improving feed efficiency, helping to prevent coccidiosis, and the heifers will reach puberty just a little bit earlier as they get closer to that upcoming breeding season, and that can be important that we get a high percentage of them cycling before the start of the season, and therefore a high percentage bred early in the upcoming breeding season. So there's several reasons to use the Oklahoma Gold program for those weaned fall-born replacement heifers, those that are going to go into their first breeding season next November. We want them big enough, we want them cycling, so we have a high percentage breed up next fall. Hey, we look forward to visiting with you again next week on SUNUP's Cow-Calf Corner.
New cattle and beef trade information has been released recently, and joining us now to talk about is Daryl Peel, our livestock marketing specialist. And Daryl, why don't we start out just kind of taking a look at the import picture?
You know, we've got record high cattle and beef prices in the U.S., and that impacts the trade flows as well. On the import side, we are seeing some increase in imports. Year to date, we're up about 6%. Most of that increase is from Australia, partly because Australia has been experiencing a drought and liquidation of cattle that's increased their beef output in the short run, but it means there'll be less at some point later on when they recover from the drought. We've also seen some increase in beef imports from Canada. However, we're down from a couple of major sources. New Zealand is down about 5%.
And then how is the export picture shaping up?
You know, the export picture is holding up really well. Again, we have record high prices. We sort of expected that might cause a little bit of decrease in beef exports. So far this year, we're up, about 7% for the year to date, actually up more sharply than that in the most recent monthly data. So we've got exports increasing to Mexico, to Japan somewhat, but we've got reduced exports to Canada, and exports to South Korea are also up. So we're doing pretty well in most of those markets.
And then in terms of the live cattle market, what's the situation there?
You know, again, we've got extremely tight feeder supplies in the U.S., record high prices. That pulls in cattle from wherever it can, which is primarily Canada and Mexico. We are seeing increased imports there. But again, numbers are relatively tight in both of those countries, particularly Mexico. And so I expect to see, those exports or those imports of cattle probably taper off a little bit as we move through the year.
And you mentioned Mexico. You just returned from a trip and got to observe a few things. What's the situation there?
You know, the Mexican beef and cattle industry has been extremely dynamic in the more than 20 years I've been going down there. Most recently, there's been a significant increase in recent years in their feedlot production capacity, in their beef packing capacity. Mexico has emerged as a rather significant global player with potential to continue growing. As I mentioned, they've emerged as the number 4 source of beef imports in the last few years. So that's been a big change, continues to grow. But it also has an impact on the way they're using their cattle, the available supplies. They've gone through a drought much like we have, and so their cattle numbers are extremely tight right now.
And then in terms of future import-export and relationships with Mexico, what do you see happening there?
Well, you know, there's 3 dimensions of the trade now. We have a pretty well-integrated market with Mexico. So in terms of the cattle imports that we've historically gotten from Mexico, because of the tight numbers in the short run and because of increased domestic demand longer term, I think we'll probably see less cattle come from Mexico to the U.S. as feeder cattle in the future. On the beef export side, again, we're seeing an increase now last year and so far this year after about a 5-year slide in that. Beef production is limited in Mexico because of tight numbers there, and so I expect to see fairly strong beef exports to Mexico. The last bit of that is the imports from Mexico, which have grown dramatically in the last 5 years until last year. They're down again, and again, because of limited production in Mexico, because of domestic demand, and because of other export market opportunities they have, we probably will see a more moderate or modest pace of growth in the future in terms of the imports of U.S. or Mexican beef in the U.S.
Okay, good information. Thanks a lot, Daryl Peel, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Now that summer is officially here, it's a great time to talk about watermelon. Joining us now is Darren Scott, a food scientist here at the Food and Ag Products Center. And Darren, before we talk about the research, the age-old question, how do you pick out the right watermelon at the farmer's market or at the grocery store?
Okay, the method that I've always used is to thump the melon, and you'll listen for a nice deep tone, and that lets you know you have a nice watermelon.
So as simple as that.
As simple as that. That's the method I've always used.
Now, you've done some research and studied watermelons. What kind of things have you found?
Okay. About 20% of the annual watermelon crop is left behind in the field as culls. But there's really nothing wrong with the melon necessarily in terms of its wholesomeness. So what can we do in terms of further processed products? So what we would like to find are products that perhaps you don't see a lot of heating involved. So something like maybe a watermelon wine that doesn't necessarily have this very high temperature processing that might do two things. One, would leave the lycopene intact, but two, would also leave a nice kind of fresh flavor.
Okay, talk a little bit about the lycopene. Is that the red, makes the red color that we see in the fruit?
Exactly, exactly. Lycopene is the red pigment that you find in watermelon, but you also find it in other products like tomatoes, persimmons, carrots. But in the U.S. diet, probably the two main sources again would be tomatoes and watermelon.
And there's some definite benefits.
Yes. The research goes, or at least at this point, the belief is that a diet that is high in lycopene may help to prevent certain types of cancer.
But where are we headed in terms of food development with real watermelon?
Okay. When you're dealing with watermelon as an actual ingredient in foods, you have a particular challenge. You know, as you heat the watermelon up, two things. One, lycopene is very sensitive to things like heat, air, and light. And so the lycopene will begin to break down. The second thing is due to again, the watermelon being in the same family as the cucumber. As you heat up the watermelon, you always get a little bit of that green flavor kind of coming through. And so it tastes more and more like cucumber and less like watermelon. And again, that kind of goes back to trying to find products that are suitable, that might not necessarily need as much heating. And one of the things that you'll see now is watermelon juice, which has been sort of this high temperature, short time pasteurization that allows you to sort of maintain those very delicate flavors, but also the color as well.
Okay, so I'll stick with the watermelon juice, sorbet, and wine.
Yes.
Okay, terrific information. Darren, thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you.
We'll see you again soon. That'll do it for us this week. Remember, you can find us anytime at sunup.okstate.edu. You can also follow us on YouTube and other social media. I'm Lyndall Stout. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll see you next time at SUNUP.